Hello everyone, today we talk about the foundation of European seigniories in the 8th century. It's a video actually about the senorial era, broadly meant referring to a bit the surroundings of the Carolingian era, for a dynamic that we mostly contingented on Schwerpunkt in the aftermath of the Carolingian Empire, right? Post-Carolingian Europe, the seigneurial system. That's very much spot on in a chronological perspective, but it's not like seigniories did not exist before, or nor early medieval Europe having not showed signs of pretty positive aristocratization of the system. The seigneurial era in general is an old topic on Schwerpunkt. We started since the very beginning, and as you know, I've been cultivating over the years with a certain constants. We will keep expanding on it because, from one side, many people seem to be interested in socio-economical topics every time I make those videos about, European demographics in the Middle Ages, the trade routes, the economic. People always assume that this is about numbers and a deterministic pattern that they can't simply reconstruct in an absolute way through a mechanical process of citation. That's not how we work in history. It's actually a much more complex assessment that is based mostly, in my experience, and simply if you get rid of structuralism, that fortunately is dying out at some level in the world, a political issue. Like at least the social one contains also the economical one, etc., but it's not really the only thing or the exclusively central dimension to this. That's the reason why in Schwerpunkt we also insist very much on evenemential history for that matter. It's important, however, to give an idea at times of the general system in a way that, in fact, intertwines the socio-political dimension. The general outlook on especially the end of the Carolingian empires, is one of degraded public authority. So further seignioralization, territorialization of private dominions. But this had begun, especially in Frankish Europe, and not only quite early in time. This video partly addresses how these seigniories were kept together from a strictly, let's say, logistical, communicational, infrastructural point of view. That is to say, yes, there is politics, there is society, but also how do they really interact, right? That the other crucial aspect about political culture, I would say, and especially when you seek for historical accuracy, differently from what most people want to reason like, because naturally it's simpler, but also less accurate, is the interconnection of these polities, right? You can't simply paranoidly reason in terms, okay, I will now pick this polity, whichever it is, because I have this preconceived notion that I should just fixate with that for whichever reason and pretend to know anything about that if you don't know about the others. They were all intertwined, and they could have not existed hadn't it been the case. This is particularly evident in such a foundational, seminal moment in European history like the 8th, the 9th century, not all. We will partly observe, of course, the role of monasteries, of abbeys, because, as you know, the ecclesiastical dimension here is really increasing in power at a quite robust pace. We can observe different aspects, starting, for example, from the sheer extent of the seigneurial territorial base. This aspect also often confounds the romantic view of medieval history as some sort of, again, everybody was on their own. Nobody knew about the rest. They were lost in some sort of fairy tale world. No, it wasn't. It completely destroys the concreteness, intelligence, and capacity of medieval politics and more. There were certain countries in Europe, especially the ones of broader Frankish tradition, because as you know, this encompasses territories that are that are far beyond, in fact, the Frankish ethnic heartland, right? The Frankish kingdom is an empire, arguably, since its very foundation in Merovingian times. So when you look at this belt of essentially Western, Central European, mostly Transalpine, from a Roman perspective, of course, world under the Franks, excluding essentially Northern Europe, so Britain, Scandinavia, you realize that a great deal of Frankish power had been founded, as we well know, by this very precocious marriage between the Franks, but especially the Merovingian dynasty, and the Gallo-Roman episcopal elites, right? And so what you have from the military and sort of the priesthood deciding to share this vast territory that at large had not been, talking mostly Gaul, had not been particularly undermined by the invasions of the migration era. Yes, there had been devastations. Yes, the general public culture had been eroded. As we know, late antiquity did gradually give way to this other system, but at large, this was true also for Spain before it was taken over by the Arabs. The Roman latifundium, those large estates run by the senators, now by the priesthood, and now essentially the warrior, by the noblemen that were also marrying to this local elites, had retained control, and especially entrenching further into it, given that, as you know, the Merovingian monarchy did not have a particularly unitary future. By the end of the 7th century, the Frankish kingdom, this Merovingian empire, has split in different chunks, and in especially the areas that were in fact more Romanized, already had important assets. This is true actually also for the more Germanized part, at least within say the Western, within Gaul, right? This is true also for what was Gallia Belgica before, and in fact the heavy structure that the Romans had given to the Rhine frontier and so on. The land had remained compact and further compacted by these great clans. The Saint Pipinid Ardno things are one of those, beautifully exemplified at Ecclesiastical and military, and the borders were blurred there, especially in the Merovingian world, between the two. Power that was fundamentally based on the possession of pretty large amounts of land, but also over pretty extended geographical scale, right? This was the case of the Roman senatorial latifundium as well, right? They were also much bigger than these early medieval ones, straddling literally multiple continents, multiple regions for sure, at a time, and also in areas where that was pretty solidly intact, very well interconnected with an ecumenic infrastructure, etc. The Franks managed to salvage part of this, and this founds essentially their proclivity also towards military clienteles of a very robust capacity, like a more elite system. Gaul is in absolute terms the richest country in Europe in the early Middle Ages and later on too, altogether. However, that enormous wealth is also concentrated in the hands of very few people that really make the establishment, the Carolingian elite, essentially that proto-feudal knightly reality that will in fact develop further without, however, choking. This is very important because it's different, say, from the Byzantine world, without choking local autonomies in the process. It's not to say, again, that the average, Gallic peasant had much individual liberty, but in many ways they fared significantly better at a point, especially with the growth of high medieval Europe than in other places. They were much more sclerotic and autocratic. naturally, having this vast patrimony of landed estates created considerable challenges in their same management for the lords themselves. Think literally this moving in early medieval Europe, also via land at large. It was done, right? It was done much more than we can also document, but of course required a specific political and administrative pattern that at this point was also largely in the hands of this spontaneous, that sometimes was formalized by a general, again, clientele connection with the king, with the nobility, etc. The nobility owned most of these lands by themselves, but there was a hierarchical connection, right? And there were also, in fact, other, still, say in the early, today we talk about the High Middle Ages at large, or at least the 8th century, so the later phase of that, when there was a growth in that kind of wealth also among, usually again, in tendentially in fewer hands than there had been before, right? And these connections were in many ways personal, right? It wasn't quite a state that basically directed, discriminated, separated the wheat from the chaff. Everything was based on your personal fortunes or whether, in fact, you were powerful, interesting, affluent enough in order to safeguard your own possessions that were, however, under this sort of bigger mob that brought you to mobilize, to contribute also with military retinues, and in a pretty unstable time in general, because wars happened, as you know, in the 8th century. Charles Martel especially recovers a great deal of these lost royal possessions, so reinforcing the state in many ways. And much of this land had been fundamentally occupied or ruled on behalf of the king for generations by bishops, by ecclesiastical lords that essentially intended a personal senorial prerogative over this land, and in fact would repay Charles Martel regardless of his victories also over the Muslims that were mostly also directed at seizing Aquitaine. In that view, right, with a not very flattering press, exactly because he had, or parchment, of course, like manuscripting, it's been this way, because he had there challenged this establishment, right, this dormant state affirmed over the generations that nobody had really come to this lodge. And of course the king did pretty much similar things, as we've seen also in a video about the Carolingian royal abbeys. There was massive amount of investment in royal ecclesiastical foundations that were a way to say, as we were pointing out before, from a hierarchical point of view, I'm doing exactly the same thing that everybody does, except I do it with greater effectiveness because I'm more powerful. And at least as a king, I, in theory, control and possess everything in the kingdom, and I can, even with the existence of lords on it, at some point claim that a territory or another ultimately belongs to me if there isn't any other merit of possession. We just partly discussed this mentality in that video about the Germanic Imperial Catholic miracle, and seeing how the Franks in particular, in the cradle of feudalism, but not only reset these standards of, let's say, personal freedom as far as the nobility was concerned, meaning if those men had won their own space within the system, they were expected obedience just because of the noble consonance between warriors that should have pointed out, I will serve my king not because I must, because he imposes it on me, but because I'm inspired by his leadership, and I'm just, following him for the degree of imperium that derives from me. We will talk, of course, about all these topics at some point again are better. But going back to the practical problem of keeping the sheer extent of this territorial base together, right, and all the challenges deriving from this economic management for the lords, when you look at the estates, you realize that they were, of course, not simply extensive unified estates, but rather a vast number of individual plots and uncultivated areas dispersed over large regions. Because, of course, the ancient world had shrunk, the situation, as we observed before, had deteriorated. So there were, of course, lands that once had belonged, for example, to the king or to noblemen that were now lost, dispersed. They had been settled maybe by someone, but all the relations, all the clientele connections tied with these lands had eventually changed. They had either vain or superimposed and, sort of complicated. In other words, there hadn't been a strong enough power to keep them together under a precise base of regulation, and especially the northern you go and less of, as you know, written culture of sort of records of possibility just to determine who was ruling in terms of rights of property is to be found. And so also the simpler the societal forms and the sort of relatively uncomplicated distribution of land, also in less fertile areas. But Gaul at large is, as we pointed out before, pretty rich. You have this massive Atlantic plains, really rich, like the fat, fertile soil. So imagine just even the prestige deriving from these possessions and the general interest in sort of wanting to defend this territory, if anything. That's mostly why the political and the military side of the story are important here. Because actually, these estates were so big that it wasn't much matter of, okay, like this is typical of the latifundium, like of simply investing, trying to make it better, specializing in crops. This was not really the time in history in which it was too much to be squeezed out of it. These individuals had so much land that just the sheer scale of production, of absolute yield, was enough, right, to place such figures at the top of the system. So you could simply get more by struggling against other leaders than trying to fix how your land was administrated. But this also, as it's known, really by all those who studied early medieval history in some actual academic depth from the sources, we know was still the basis of it all. What do you think that mostly documents from this era discuss, also from a legal point of view? Land possession, right? Not even exploitation, but possession. Like, to whom did this belong? Like, how would the local communities side in certain circumstances of political upheaval, and who could control what, right? They will talk more in depth about this aspect. Consider that, as I was saying before, so the Transalpine world at large is not so overwhelmingly documented in general. There are, however, some indicators that make us understand fairly a lot overall. And at large, especially if we head towards the Carolingian era proper and the empire later, you realize that these regions, by being at the center of the empire and being now ever more prestigious and, in a sense, ever better controlled, ever safer, in the early Carolingian era, they were really key to the administration of the entire empire, and those at the head of it would have worked and invested also to increase the management, the exploitation of such estates. As we observed before, there was a certain continuity with the past. In late antiquity, a powerful family's land holdings were frequently spread across distant locations due to marriage alliances. There was yet another very clever way to augment your patrimony, both natural and artificial kingships, as well as private acquisitions made in the provinces governed by officials. It was all a late Roman pattern to early medieval administration. Gaul, again, having, in spite of the general transformations, actually much more to do with it than we generally think. Because again, this was sort of the vaster, the better run, at least in strictly senorial, proto-feudal terms, land in Europe. It was already that kind of oligarchically and equestrianly arranged and managed space of the world. The unchecked growth of the new military aristocracy had, however, intensified during the migration era competition among heirs. As you know, in the Frankish world, and this would continue for a long time, arguably the greatest factor of medium short-term instability was dynastic inheritance. The Franks did not want really to accept that a greater concentration of power was needed within the same dynasty line, or at least this was all the rulers' tendencies, except their siblings, their brothers, wanted an equal amount of land during their inheritance. This was an old Germanic law. It would remain. This is particularly evident, especially like as society, as we were saying before, was simpler in the early Middle Ages at large in many cultures. But let's say the less the less developed northern eastern world will drag on with this stuff for really a long time. Just the other day we made that video about the Principality of Galicia, and we've seen how still by the 12th, the 13th century, there was the sense that the brothers, the nephews could have a say regarding who had to inherit what, even in particularly at least in absolute terms, advanced systems compared to this early medieval ones. The Franks eventually will, Western feudalism by the 12th or 13th century would have now a final settlement regarding the fact that the firstborn son was to inherit a larger part of the system. The more advanced principalities, like we've seen it for the Duchy of Burgundy already by the 12th or 13th century, were crystal about that. They had even, in that case, ousted basically any other sibling from inheritance, if not of specific tenures associated with a certain pension that had basically nothing to do with the fact that the entirety of the duchy was in the hands of just of the current duke, right? So also the Franks would understand the lesson, but it took half of a millennium, or actually more, right? Almost an entire one to fix this issue. That's the same reason, again, why the Merovingian kingdom got split in four. Charlemagne, Louis the Pious were lucky to have to remain essentially, and paradoxically, the last male heir to their father. Otherwise, we would have not had technically a Carolingian empire. Even like it would have remained split in different magnificent chunks of this enormously, again, wealthy Frankish world. You see there the tension between Charlemagne and Carloman, and also the international reflection, because these were already, like in the later Carolingian partitions, major regional chunks of Europe that would simply pass into these various rural hands on the basis of this dynastic shifts and more. Making that little step back, when the Franks settled as Germanic invaders in Gaul, they of course contributed to a certain degree of fragmentation, which it's true especially at a medium level, because at an upper level, Clovis, telling the truth, literally beheads all the higher nobility of the Franks that, as you know, were not quite a cohesive people before. They were mostly like a cluster of chiefdoms more than else. Clovis uses the Iron Fist, and ever since the Merovingians rise above basically all the rest of the Frankish nobility in a very innovative way for those people. But of course, at a local level, the provincial level, you do have, also because of the historical degradation of the latifundium system, the fragmentation of the same estates, held also by people that, in line of principle, according to that same mindset of I basically own this thing on my own and there is no real authority above me, except in the case of the Franks, there is, do found a bit that sense of prerogative, that sense of voodoo proper of the primus inter pares mentality still to be found again before the lock of the nobility in the third quarter of the 12th century, right? Not an anarchic reality, but one that was ready to contest this and challenge authority regarding those original rights. That's also how, say, Western Francia fragmented so quickly of all the Carolingian, post-Carolingian kingdoms, not because it was weaker in concrete terms. Actually, it was the richer land, but because exactly for this, the local lordships were stronger, and in the absence of a consensus regarding the existence of a monarch capable of imposing its authority, would happen literally in a full way just in the 13th century, at least by feudal standards. So half of a millennium later, they would just remain there, and there is this, in fact, also relatively fake image of crisis and weakness of these systems, while they were starting to produce literally the great medieval Western civilization. It's not really paradoxical in this light that such places would be the most, had already been the most advanced in Europe from Roman times. We're talking, there are other areas, like for example, northern Italy and northern Gaul at large are the truly better administered ones. If you look at the Carolingian politics, notoriously these are the regions illustrating, if anything, in the Longobards kingdom was wealth was more evenly spread, but also this led to a system that was in fact advanced in other ways, also especially from a mercantile point of view and beyond. In northern France, really have the cradle of real heavy feudalism that you can see being different from Occitania, where even there, like, wealth was more evenly spread, but still was a feudal system at large, and so it was nor the one nor the other, and did not go on to become like other than just from an artistic, for example, point of view, a great cradle of later medieval civilization, or at least political, a military, unified power, right? But this is another story. In general, it was, as you understand, in the 6th, the 7th century, but still parts of the 8th, very difficult to simply claim all the fragmented and dispersed land back from a political point of view. The Franks will witness this major royal comeback with the Carolingians that truly did battle their way through these seigneuries that had formed in the absence of a strong royal authority during Merovingian times. But it was also at that point a matter of cooptation, a matter of reinstatement, reinstatement of loyal followers, so basically restarting the same decentralized form of government. There was really no other one. We extensively discussed the essentially private nature of Carolingian Frankish public culture. At large, certain Carolingian rulers were more enlightened. They began to heavily invest in the church to try to, from there, start some kind of more compact dominions that they could more easily administrate the empire from, so avoiding this continuous redistribution, fragmentation, and instability, especially in the lay establishment. But let's consider this. We're talking 8th century, again, goal. And even in the more advanced parts of it, there historically hadn't been, this enormous statal foundations from a historical point of view. They were not quite there yet, or at least they were just forming under the Carolingians for this relentless effort of uniforming the ecclesiastical standards. The comital administration was a massive Roman influence that was imported from the Mediterranean, from the papacy, from the Italic kingdom, that were light years ahead in terms of civil development. But that, not even that was enough, right? The Carolingians managed especially to found a truly solid ecclesiastical culture, like a standardized script, a monastic connective fabric that could really keep the system, and would keep the system together even at the moment of public shortcoming, at the decline of royal authority. But the fundamental issue of privatization and oligarchization was never fully resolved. Again, the great advantage of the West, of Latin Germanic Europe at large, was that even this tumultuous feudal development did not choke the autonomies of the local communities. This did not have, of course, like an enormous margin for maneuver, just with essentially a feudal elite reigning, but they weren't posing themselves in mutually exclusive fashion, right? It wasn't an old state trying to perpetuate itself, like trying to choke any form of autonomy. That, again, valor, a recognition of local capacity, was still an essential part of the system, and in part because the system was so fragmented since the beginning. I mean, you couldn't do without, for example, the knightly backbone of your military. That were the same guys that needed that little signory, at least compared to the royal one, to maintain a knightly lifestyle that, compared to the other population, had, if anything, to serve that. But that helped, and we've seen it in many videos, including the one of Otto Cluny's biography of Gerald of Aurillac. That was a sense of responsibility attached to this autonomy. It was in many ways just like the normal consequence of this political institutional balance, and that would prove to be, in any case, effective over the centuries, especially in this formula. So you don't really see ever a form of true centralization. You see this man himself, like, as king's supporters of some crown lands that technically belonged to the king, but that could not be administered if not by someone really working on them. And you had to content this establishment as well. You couldn't simply carve out dominions where you would make just, some ministerialis work. This could be done paradoxically in Eastern Francia, because that royal margin was actually weaker, and the same nobiliar one was, so you could cope paradoxically more easily serfs, so not to witness them like actually inheriting. We've seen it with the ministerialis, in fact, knightly class later, that would not inherit and split. They had always to obey what the Lord said. In the West, if anything, the church was chosen because they were extracted always from the same nobility, but they could not at least technically split or inherit in a personal sense, especially like the secular clergy, right? Bishoprics, archbishoprics. If anything, there were a lot of private foundations, including again, the Carolingian royal abbeys, but at least the church was not was manageable. Was you could change people at the top because they were not dynastically controlling it by law, by culture, by identity. Church property, for this reason, also was often very widely scattered. A substantial part was derived from considerable royal or noble endowments that, of course, had a strategic purpose in certain areas, saying, okay, this is church lands, I will just protect. And I explained it, again, in that video about the Carolingian royal abbeys. There were lots of people who would prefer to become ecclesiastical vassals than lay ones because of the privileges that these ecclesiastical islands enjoyed. There were also much bigger ecclesiastical conglomerations, of course, that worked as massive estates that would reinforce, in fact, during medieval times, especially in those areas that were more sort of fragmented, in fact. It's now complex to explain. And we're talking especially Eastern Francia, but there are also some steps in that. If you're interested, especially in this topic, check out the video I made about the feudalization of the episcopal investitures after the concordat of Worms, but we're consistently later in time. Or similar superimposable situations. It's not such a large amount of time away, 300 years, and East Francia was also grew a bit more slowly from these times. But at large, immunities, prerogatives, etc., would allow the church to compact this ecclesiastical principalities. There were, during the Carolingian era, however, also many smaller donations that removed plots from noble estates and divided fields from modest proprietors. So not even the church, but just more reliable vassals, people that had more to sacrifice, let's say, for the, let's say, less to sacrifice to the king, but more to obtain in reward. In this sense, the Carolingian military was actually a place where you could stand out and becoming even more favorite than the higher nobility. This is what Charlemagne himself sought to do, like co-opting more loyal sort of outsiders from a political and social point of view, as long as they fought well and they knew their deal. Right? That's a similar dynamic to the one of the ministeriales in East Francia. Later on, by the way. Such donations were typically linked to the renown of the saints to whom the churches were dedicated in an ecclesiastical case, which could attract the generosity of donors from great distances. I made multiple videos, especially about French pilgrimages, relics, traveling, right? And that is helpful because we've seen how much wealth actually could revolve around these centers. Gaul was plenty of such localities because, especially of the Occitanian fragmentation of power, the greater, say, cultic tradition, greater tradition from greater continuity, let's say, from the Roman world in certain areas. And it's a bit complicated to explain. We will surely make multiple videos on that. But if you're interested, I made that one about the Merovingian and Carolingian hagiographic system. That is actually incredibly important. If people knew about Christian hagiography from the Merovingian era rather than the Norse sagas, there's an unjustifiable disproportion in pop culture simply because people are trained to hate standards and to pretend to like things they don't even know, by the way. And, of course, knowing a geography is too demanding. But you find there an enormous amount of traditional legacy as far as the symbols of this holiness right? Also a great deal of military and traditional symbolism beyond. Think about this enormous sanctuaries like the one of Saint Martin of Tours. That also was a hell of a equestrian knightly part of a great deal of military tradition, as we will also come. A beautiful video about Saint Martin of Tours cult in an Imperial Catholic traditional sense is actually very, very much appropriate for Schwerpunkt. The sense was tying, however, this local faith, this local tradition with the individual seigneury. Hence the aforementioned example of Gerald of Aurillac, especially. It's such a dark moment of post-Carolingian disarray is so relevant. You can check the aforementioned video out about Gerald of Aurillac, but also the recent one I made, relatively recent one I made on Cluny, like how and why Cluny stands out, like what kind of, and why, in fact, like in that biography by Aldo, the necessity of a secular holiness is really celebrated and emphasized. This also shows you how actually connected the church and the empire, so to say, actually were throughout all this era, regardless of the, say, more secular disputes over factual control. But there is an immense tradition behind this that we have partly forgotten to an unforgivable degree. When you look at also the new secular aristocracies, you realize that we're talking early medieval times in general. This new aristocracy exhibited, generally speaking, a lack of diligence in managing their estates compared to the ancient landowners. They were more militarized. They just had less tools really to successfully administer these lands in a long-term thinking fashion. The ancients had definitely been more adept at overseeing their revenues, even when they had the latifundistic attitude. There was sort of a better administration, a greater uniformity also in the way this land was managed in terms of the exploitation of resources. If you read Gregory of Tours, you realize what kind of mindset like the average Frankish count could have, like in the 6th century, right? They were very unruly, they were very unregulated to an extent, but it was also the obvious consequence of the times. It's not like these people were not lucid or capable. It's just that they had greater priorities in a climate of general instability and also cultural, let's say, gap, right, that really absorbed further resources and were trying to keep things together in a time which, like, the big empire that had kept things together so successful for such a long time had gone, and now that it was all a moral vacuum that these newcomers could barely replenish. Hence, a certain also degree of warlikeness maintained, especially by the elites, that are truly the protectors of the local population, that truly rise as some form of holy warriors endowed with that mission to maintain things in order. Right? It's beautiful to read Gerald of Aurillac's biography, because of course, even though, as you know, the Cluniac reform was run, like it was the case for the Carolingian world, by noblemen, by aristocrats that were thus reinforcing their own secular relatives at the same time. We do know from, say, popular beliefs, the general folklore and religious mindset, that the people, the lesser people, were, generally speaking, comforted morally by such order. They were the ones who essentially accepted these terms. You can't distinguish imposition from the top from, let's say, acceptance from the or even delegation from the below, right? It's all one. When we've seen often how this process happened also in the making of Carolingian cavalry, the gradual abandonment of the traditional militia levy, or the rota system, the functionalization of society towards some kind of more effective military that has the epitome here in the already pretty strong Carolingian, but already back in the day Merovingian cavalry that was really a power to be reckoned with, and in an ever more sort of Panzerritter kind of direction. So there's ever more technically and professionally skilled to fulfill that role that everybody was looking at and coming with very strong responsibility, moral capacity, and so on. That did not extend merely, of course, to the military activity, but also to the land management, to the administration of these communities in a very personal way. I mean, up to a couple of 100 years ago, Europe was like this. I mean, there was a lord, there was someone. The land belonged to some more powerful individual that the others were somehow tied to in some clientary fashion, and also derived some kind of prestige and security from. It was very burdensome for the elite as well, because the standards, in fact, were truly elite. When you look at, however, this previous centuries, you realize that during the migration era, the new elites were often unfamiliar with written records. These were the kind of basic limits they had. In this area, ecclesiastical entities generally had a distinctly advantageous position, as you understand, over the layman when it came to estate management. It doesn't make much sense to distinguish this from an ethnic point of view, because again, we're talking about Gallo-Roman, Germanic establishment here. You can't divide. Like, you can't say, again, the St. Carolingians descending from whom? From the Pepinids, the Arnulf things. So literally a comital and episcopal lineages, respectively, that marry into one another. It is not like Arnulf of Metz, which was just a priest close in his church praying all the time. These were military leaders. They had also, by the way, an immense power overall. They were really princes in their own regard. We sort of forgot that part. We shall talk more about Merovingian history, because it's really, really beautiful, and it's just such a large swathe of Europe that is unbelievable how we sort of crossed it out even from popular reference. And Carolingians were in part responsible for this, because they acted as if they had invented a system that were continuing literally the identical one of the Merovingians, just in a better time in history also, where they could take it to the next level, but with the same substance, basically. But in general, you can make the case, of course, that whoever was destined to an episcopal career was historically more provided with a sense of written connection, not just with the predecessors on the episcopal throne, but think at the regional, say, conciliar tradition. Also the ecumenical one back in the day. The idea of recording the acts of councils and sort of deriving from that rules for the local church, and including land management, because a lot of these councils also dealt with these more concrete aspects of, ecclesiastical administration, favored written records, but mostly in that ecclesiastical dimension. From a lay point of view, you can argue there wasn't even this overarching need just to write down things, considering, again, the level of, we're talking about centuries like the 7th. Everything was based on some kind of action, even in the cases of the larger estates. That it's never just directly proportional. sometimes you really have to culturally adapt to the notion, for example, that no, you're not in the forest anymore. You have to live in the city. You have to administer the land that has, by the way, an enormous level of tradition of also infrastructural, logistical potential that you will have to gradually reactivate. It's just hard work. It's not merely an administrative issue of just writing or not writing. And in fact, a gigantic effort is actually made to improve the conditions of the system. Just we can't fully document it because it was more limited just by the shortages of the time. But it's completely normal in perspective. The revenue produced by a large estate seldom converted, except in minor amounts, into liquid wealth, readily available in cash for the owner's requirements. Most of this world was overwhelmingly barter-based. There was, of course, some monetary circulation that was present also in Northern Europe. If you look at the Anglo-Saxons, etc. So the Franks had already had a historical as very solid tie with places like the Longobards, the Papacy, also the broader Mediterranean traffics. They themselves administered huge amounts of surplus at large. So some monetary precious metal circulation did exist in consistent fashion, but still early medieval standards. And again, countries that at large had been devoid of states, of any particular administrative structure, at least from Roman times, where that had been much lighter than we generally assume, right? So everything had to reboot, to recover, also from a geographical background that had historically not been that culturally exposed to very solid civil organization. For this naturally is the measure of the limit of also international traffic in that time. It's not like intercontinental traffic, for example, did not exist at this time. We know it pretty well. We know it pretty well because, say, I don't know, there is a certain type of color in 7th century manuscripts that could have been extracted, or at least we know being extracted specifically from a specific stone that time arrived in Europe only from Afghanistan, and somebody must have brought it from there. All right. This shows you actually how also carefully handle all these things were, because everything was more precious in relative terms compared just to a few centuries later. This tells you also how everybody at the time was aware about the frailty, the delicacy of the system. Reason for which, even if these traffics existed, they couldn't have a very strong volume, right? And the lack of sort of monetary circulation compared to previous centuries is quite indicative. In the 8th century, especially the second half, you start having a greater reboot of monetary economy, also because the Carolingians are taking over a bit more stuff, so they have a more concentrated capacity of minting and standardization in that regard. They just also conquer more lands. They have more precious metals stored under the strong monarchy, and so things restart. For the reasons previously mentioned regarding itinerant kings and the support of their officials, there are also other interesting factors, including itinerant courts and itinerant kings, meaning multiple ones at the same time, as we were saying before, like there is a quadripartite Francia, or at least, it also included, it was the two halves of Francia, Neustria and Austrasia, and Burgundy and Aquitaine, that met at a sort of at four corners in the center of Gaul, or in the northeast of Gaul, and they worked, they traveled with their officials, essentially being routinely visited and or just also cooperating with the court. you have substantial private land owners that necessitated to move from one region to another at times to reside, a bit like little courts on their own with their entourage on their various estates. This is very important because it shows how tendentially that oligarchic vector was heading even people that were historically not of noble blood to imitate even the courtly, the kingly lifestyle, right? And this was due to the aforementioned extension of their possessions, right? The bigger your estates, and at large the wealthier you become. But there are also lots of non-noblemen that at some point will become actual aristocrats in the measure in which they will be able to provide for the kingdom the aforementioned mounted military service. This is just a tendency, especially again towards the mid-8th century, that you find in other countries, also the ones that are eventually going to be conquered by the Carolingians, like the Lombard one. There is the necessity of mobilizing an elite that is co-opted in the process, exhibiting the typical traits connected with courtly lifestyle and behavior. That's very important, as it will also foster further those forms of military organization based on the antrusiones, so those that you could trust and that had in fact sworn an oath of allegiance to their leaders, and that were in fact maintained as just the familia, the masnata, right, of the Lord, as it would evolve more concretely and formally in the later centuries. But it really starts from this. It really starts from people that would work for you, and again, even if you hadn't historically had a military lifestyle, because we're a third estate, or you would gradually be, if you were successful enough, of course, co-opted into a broader aristocracy. And at that point, what's the difference? Like the tripartite order is a real thing historically, just that different functions overlap at a time one another. In contrast, ecclesiastical entities, particularly monastic communities, faced significant difficulties due to the need for stability demanded of religious groups. The church was historically less militarized, even though the Frankish world witnesses a great deal of militarization of the clergy from an early era, but this is true also in the Visigothic or the Lombard world, among the Anglo-Saxon to an extent, but mostly, in fact, in these countries that had more surplus, they were sort of more socially stratified and required to more affluent landowners, also from more public statal bases, and were forming gradually in the Latin Germanic world, and or had been continuing from the Roman times. These powerful men to at least lead. This was the thing for the abbots, for the bishops, to lead their military contingents at least to the front lines. Then not necessarily fighting, but many would, and you know the thing would continue throughout practically all the Middle Ages. But at large, they were less militarily equipped in many ways than the secular, let's say at least the lay nobility. Naturally, bishops were tendentially more powerful than, abbots, but in some of these contexts there is a great blur. Later, abbots would become incredibly powerful also from a military point of view. But at last, bishops were controlling cities. They had this older sort of interconnection with the regional, the international world through Rome, through these. In fact, this universal institution that the church was, regardless, in fact, of the less compact, like secular, the lay institutions. But for this reason, they were also more exposed to the latter, so that technically, also the reason why the church will support the state there is to escape a bit this pretty oppressive force of the lay nobility that was always up for a fight and tendentially threatening the same ecclesiastical prerogatives and immunities. There is all the historical problem of, again, the king, the priesthood, the warriors, say, like what would be exemplified later in the investiture controversy existing here. They were really felt and believed ideas, but never in an anti-traditional sense of like these elements. That was an allogen element, an element that should have not been there. The priesthood was understood as necessarily, as fully at the root of military power. At the same time, regardless of what lesser people think today, as if, you know, the clergy or Christianity were there just for no reason, or like there is just a dualistic contrast between two different forces in nature. That's just Gnostic heresy, for that matter, not just an erroneous historical or political belief. In any case, this requirement forced large abbeys to arrange complex transportation systems to transfer agricultural products from their far-flung estates to the location where the community was situated. Because, together with the military organization, such centers, including also the lay ones, would have to provide with a steady amount of, especially of fodder, that was the forage for horses, located at different stations across these estates that were crossed by the same royal army that had to be foraged, had to be supplied. And I promised myself to make this video about the Carolingian logistics, because if you wonder how the Franks succeeded in such large enterprises, also in a time in which you couldn't objectively obtain any sort of overall big sort of strategic sophistication. I mean, armies were as rudimentary as they were, actually very sophisticated and effective and qualitative for the time, but an enormous effort in this was, again, the material background of this all. Like, massive strategic and logistical feats could be obtained only through massive resources storage in view of war, which was, however, such a frequent, if not perennial, reality in the Frankish world that whether internally or externally, turned that literally the entire system had developed like this in the centuries. Remember that the Frankish accounts, say of the time of Charles Martel, tell you normally, they will talk about various military events, etc., but they will tell you about a given year. This year there wasn't a military expedition, because for them it was more important to mention the years in which there hadn't been a military expedition and the ones in which they regularly happen all the time in the good season, starting normally from May. The field of May, you know, the sort of Charlemagne's army. Well, it was normal for them, keeping all these military retinues busy, because as long as they were busy against external or internal threats, they would not try to entrench into some local privilege and sit there and trying to undermine royal authority. If they could gain from the destruction of different enemies, internal or external, they would keep fighting. This is how the military machine of Charlemagne was fueled by, and the clergy was all one with that, right? This dynamic spilled over into the civil administration, because if you had to build all these warehouses, always replenishing them, having this system perpetually going on with a collection of the peasantry surplus, and you just needed it because you needed to have military retinues at times just to give to the king, or just to maintain on your own. It was all part of the same. It was baked into it. At the same time, you needed to organize these places very well. You needed to administer them very well. And that gave Europe, by the way, a massive edge that way. Like, of course, the rest of the world worked in similar ways, but the level of Romano-Germanic, say, civil and warrior combination of this era is really something that is deeply molding the very fabric of what we know Europe today. And in ways that were, again, astonishing. This was a massive enterprise for the needs of the time. One well-known historical account details the extensive transport service managed by the Abbey of the Novalesa in Piedmont, founded in the 8th century along the route from Susa to the Mont Cenisio. As you know, this was one of the most strategically important valleys in Europe because it connected France with it was the easiest route, right, from Gaul into Lombardy, into Italy. So basically the Franks had been stronger than the Longobards on the western frontier. This is the same reason why today, for example, France still owns the valley up to the plain. Normally the border with countries, it's just a watershed, right, up mountain. Instead, this is a Franco-Longobard legacy because ever since the early Middle Ages, the Franks were stronger, and from there they had the upper hand, right? Remember the famous phrase of von Clausewitz about how to assault France from Italy is just like, attacking, trying to grab a bayonet with your hands. It's like, it was in part like that at the time. And this abbey needed, by the way, it needed to sustain itself, but it was really in between these massive systems, and its transport system would be so crucial, so much so it would be crippled by at least all these routes also in the Alps would become unsafe when the Saracens of Fraxinetum in Provence would come to infest those areas at a point. The famous Abbot Maiolus was captured. We'll talk about that because it's a very important, also international issue at the time. But just for saying how I like to add these specific references because this is no sort of faceless world. It's the same exact places where we live, and it's like understanding that the face of Europe here is really what you could have seen in part already at the time. But speaking of the Novalesa, by the way, we'll come back on this place because it's really interesting. Coordinated specifically in this sense from in terms of forage or supplies, the collection of wheat and wine from its estates at specified locales where a cart equipped with a signaling belt would periodically travel to lead other carts and ensure that what was owed to the monastery was delivered. There was sort of a caravan, right, of carts. Consider that the same Charlemagne, for example, moved with carts. One was apparently from one of his Italian journeys ever since filled with cheese, which was offered to him. It's not like Gaul did not have cheese, frankly, and I understand that, right? But also the Longobards had a strong tradition, and apparently he was so fond of the latter that he decided to bring always a lot with him. And so imagine for the time standards what kind of wealth that represented. Like considering the general poverty of the time, the primitivity of the system, like what it meant just to have this cart with a bell that signaled, say, along the valleys, along the communities, that it was time just to contribute to send in the other carts to replenish the supplies of the Novalesa Abbey, that again was a lordship, like a landlordship, and it required this wealth also for the general, again, crossings of the Alps for the royal, the imperial military eventually. So we're talking about like the very concrete phase of that world, how it was really moved and how it was really managed. right? It's incredibly difficult, in a sense, to project yourself into that order of things, even when with an adequate historical background. But when you realize the force moving such enterprises, you realize how, say, where the motivation lays, why this was done. At least in Schwerpunkt, I always sought to explain history in these specific terms, not much just how it happened, which is not that straightforward. Even people have difficulties, for example, to understand how a society without at least contemporary state worked. They had their own state, and they knew how to make it work to that extent. But I mean, motivation, right, predates that. But motivation brings the thing to happen in the first place. State is not alive if it is not properly handled and sustained and properly conceived, right? So it's all extremely complex, but it's also easy once you understand it, when you get the fundamentals, and that of course takes time, and you always discover such backgrounds, let's say, from even such examples, but it must be known step by step. And also that's also why I make this kind of videos, to begin with. What else to say? Well, we could say really a lot, especially if we were to enter the military sphere. However, this video is not designed for that. There will be others, right? But understanding how the Frankish system worked, this is incredibly crucial. This is incredibly foundational, and it must be fully taken care of. Right? These are just fundamental chapters in early and high medieval history. Very well, I am thinking just about what else I could discuss, but at large we have covered the fundamental topic. For any video, like at this point I'm undecided whether to merge. This is just an administrative issue that does not concern you more than much, but I wanted to point out how there is actually a substantially large amount of content that we made already on this topic. I don't know how many people watched this in general also later on. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.